to start James today. James chapter 1 is what we're going to cover. I have an introduction and then two main points or parts to this chapter. I hope everybody did their homework. I don't know about you, but I just really love circling, drawing, coloring, highlighting, making notes, drawing lines, all the things on a big piece of paper that has a lot of room and space so that I can make all the notes. So I just like doing that.
I was going to print mine one-sided and I forgot to change it. But
Yeah. That's always helpful too, so then you have the back side to write whatever you want or whatever. But anyway, we'll just begin. Okay, so first of all, the book itself was probably the earliest New Testament book written. The earliest New Testament letter written. James, probably around the middle of the first century, about 50, maybe the late 40s, somewhere in there. Written by a man named James. Now, there are lots of Jameses in the Bible, a lot of them. There were two apostles named James. Do you remember that? James, the son of Zebedee, James, the son of Alphaeus. Both of them were James, but this is not him. There was a James the Less. He was a son of Mary, a brother of Joseph from Mark 15. That's not this one. Then there was in Luke 6:16 a mention of James, whose father was Judas. Not Judas Iscariot, but a different Judas, and so there's a James there. But of course, we know this James, most people really believe that this is the half-brother of Jesus. Of course, we know from John 7 that all of Jesus' siblings were unbelievers while he was alive. So they did not believe that he was Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. But things changed, right? And James became quite a significant leader in the church in the first century. He, many believe because of Acts 21:18, he was an elder there. Paul includes his name there when he's meeting with James and the other elders, something like that in there. So he, a significant leader. He was prevalent in the church. Paul also said in Galatians 2:9, he referenced James, Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars in the church. Remember that? So he's very significant, but I love personally how he describes himself in verse 1. He doesn't ascribe any of these things to him, even though he qualifies for all of them as being the brother and leader and etc. But instead he describes himself as a servant. So we see a little bit of his character here. He definitely had the attitude of a servant. He had, and of course this is critical if you're a leader of any sort in the church, to have this kind of attitude. This is what real biblical leadership looks like. And of course this echoes a lot of what Jesus said. Remember, he said, I came to serve, not to be served. He also said, if you want to be greatest in the kingdom, be a servant. So James really lives this out, actually, and we get a really huge glimpse into that in this very first verse. The first verse also says that who this letter is addressed to. It's addressed to the 12 tribes in the dispersion or of the dispersion. The Greek word there, dispersion, is diaspora. And I think we probably talked about this in class before when we were going through all the just kind of broad overviews of each New Testament book. But the dispersion here means those who were scattered following their Babylonian captivity. Okay, we've talked about how many of the Jews did come back to Jerusalem, but many didn't. And so they were scattered throughout the world, and we have evidence of this, of course, from Acts 2, when the apostles are all there, and they are speaking all of these languages because there's Jews from other countries and nations who speak different languages now as a result of this dispersion. So it's primarily James is writing to Jewish Christians, or I guess I could say Christian Jews, who are not centrally located in Jerusalem. The word, that's not important. The other thing is 12 tribes. So I think this is really interesting. 12 tribes, of course, harkens back to Old Testament, right? With God's nation of people, Israel. In Exodus 19:6, he said that you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Peter borrows from this too. Remember in 1 Peter 2:9, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a special people to God. So this verse alone tells us that James had a very good understanding of Old Testament scriptures. He really understood, like what Paul said in Romans 15:4, whatever things were written before were written for our learning. And so James really did not understand the Old Testament scriptures. And of course, if you read through all of James, do you remember some Old Testament people he references throughout his book? There's a couple in chapter 2, there's a couple in chapter 5. Do you remember them?
So you're asking what? I'm sorry.
The Old Testament people. Abraham, yeah.
Abraham and us, and then
Uh-huh.
I don't know. You said chapter 5. I don't know about that one.
In chapter 2, he mentions Rahab and Abraham. Chapter 5, he mentions the patience of Job, yes, and the prophet Elijah who prayed. Remember that? Yeah. So, from what I've read and reading about this person, James, and because I'm not a scholar, but I trust what other scholars say as a whole, I guess. Many scholars rank James's writing in the Greek as like up there, scholarly. Luke was a doctor. He was very well educated, and you can tell it apparently in his writing. And James is the same. Writes along the same caliber as that, a very scholarly, kind of his use of the Greek language hits the scholarly ranks apparently, which is very interesting. And he relied heavily on the LXX. You remember the Greek Septuagint? So the Greek translation of the Old Testament instead of on the Hebrew scriptures themselves. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated in Greek, that's primarily what James used apparently, from what the scholars say when they read the Greek of his letter, that he used primarily or relied heavily on the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. All right, so there's kind of the introduction to this letter, but what is the main message of the letter? What's the point? What's the theme and thesis of James's letter? Well, I think it is chapter 2, verse 17. Look there real quick. It just says there that so also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And so we're looking at a faith that needs works in order to be alive. Otherwise, it just really isn't faith. It's dead faith is the way James describes it. But the book of James not only tells us by his words what a living, active faith looks like, but he also shows us. He uses a lot of word pictures throughout his letter, and they illustrate greatly what an active faith looks like. And so James makes it really easy for visual learners. If you are a visual person, James is right up your alley. He makes it really easy, and if you are an artist, and you could very easily draw out his letter. Super easy. And by the way, if you're a Bible class teacher of kids, that's a great way to teach James. Have your students draw the letter. They'll get it, and they'll never forget it. It's a really fun way to teach the book to children. So faith. Faith is the umbrella under which we will look at each chapter, so that at the end of each chapter, we can ask ourselves, does my faith look like that? Which brings me to this. Because James is a very practical letter for Christians of every age, no matter where you are in your walk, because of that, it applies equally across the board to everybody no matter where you are in your walk. This study is hopefully will lead us to more personal, purposeful, active faith. And so the goal really isn't to dissect the words and the text, although that can be helpful, as we'll see today too, but it's to now apply it and live it out. So I really hope that we'll give it our best effort to put forward an active attempt at applying these principles personally. There's a ton of them to choose from. Don't get overwhelmed with it. Pick one each week or two and just really try to mold your faith and grow that faith. And at the end of each class, I'll give some suggestions on ways to apply each chapter. But I do encourage you to think along those lines as we study this book. This is a great opportunity for 5 weeks to grow your faith, to be more active in your faith. Of course, the goal is not to have a dead faith. We don't want that. Okay, so the big point number 1 is faith under trial. This will cover verses 2 through 18. And then the next big point will be the rest of the chapter. But faith under trial, this is really what verses 2 through 18 is about. And we'll divide this up by section. The first section is verses 2 through 4. Will somebody read it, please?
You said chapter 2?
Chapter 1.
Oh, chapter 1.
2 through 4. Did I say chapter 2? I meant chapter 1. I'm
2 through
sorry.
4?
Yes, chapter 1, 2 through 4.
My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing.
Very good. So, trials. They're going to come. They're an inevitable part of life. They're part of God's plan for you. But they are meant to be a stimulus to your faith. Trials. This word varies from the word that he uses later in the book, temptations, in the sense that trials are more like those kind of active experiences we have that will prove your mettle, really. They're more than likely situations outside of your control. So a disease, a death, a persecution, something that is afflicting you that you really had no say about. So that's kind of the distinct difference between that and a temptation, which is one that you struggle with personally that entices you to sin. Okay, so trials, they're going to come. But he's given us, we see here, the means by which to handle these trials. And he says it right off. Count it all joy. Of course, that seems counterintuitive to do that, to think that when you're facing a difficult situation that you are supposed to count it joy. Yeah, well, you are. Count it all joy, he says, because joy is not necessarily the product of your circumstance, but it's the expression of your faith in the middle of that circumstance. And so he says to have joy. And the word here actually is connected with the word greetings in verse 1. It's from the same root word, which means cheer or gladness or a calm delight. So count it all joy. Why? Because of verse 3. The testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Your version may say patience. There's the first occurrence of our word faith. If you did the homework, it should be circled or highlighted in a color. All right. Steadfastness. The Greek word there is hypomone, which is a compound word. Hypo means under, and mone means to abide or continue. So it really kind of means to bear up under the trial that you're facing in order to persevere. Continue. So when you're facing a trial, this trial of your faith produces this ability to bear up under it. If you've been through any trials, you know you've experienced that in a real way, and you really know what that means. But what's most interesting about this word, hypomone, is that it has a bookend at the end of the chapter. And so if you'll look in chapter 5 and verse 11, James uses it one more time, and these are the only 2 times in the letter that he uses this word. Somebody can read it. 5:11.
Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful.
There you go. So you can see how that word is at the beginning and at the end, bookends to James's letter about bearing up under, remaining steadfast in the face of trials. So he kind of begins the letter with this situation of trials, count it all joy, and then he kind of ends it with the example of Job, persevering or being steadfast. I mean, not persevering, that's a little bit different word.
I'm sure you'll talk about this in the end, so I may be jumping ahead, because this book is so rich in application. One of the, it's one of my favorites. One of the things that we say at home whenever Griffin says it and I say it, whenever something is difficult for us, but like you said, the distinction between, you know, our being tempted to sin versus like we're going through something difficult. We just always go, we just say, count it all joy. Count it all joy. And we just repeat it, and she'll repeat it, and sometimes I'll just hear her saying, count it all joy. And,
I think that's wonderful.
It's just a little tiny little life application that we do.
It's a great mantra.
We just say, count it all joy.
repeat.
And it somehow, for me at least, when I started doing it, I like to repeat things to myself, talk to myself a lot. I'll have little conversations like, get it right, get yourself together. And I'll say, count it all joy. And it does make you kind of just smile a little bit and can kind of help you to refocus during your trial on not getting mired down and the trial.
Yes, I think
the trial itself.
Sure, that's exactly right. That's my personal experience with the count it all joy phrase was when I was diagnosed with that was the thing I tried to remember all the time. That's when that really became applicable to me, or hit me the hardest. So that was my mantra during that time was count it all joy, count it all joy, count it all joy. Yes, it became very, very personal during that time. But yeah, that's a great one. I many of you know, may or may not know, I don't know, but I draw letters. I letter things, and so that's one of the things I letter a lot in different styles. If I don't know what I'm going to draw and I just want to draw, I will letter that and draw that and 1,000 different times. But yes, I love it. Very good. Okay, so steadfastness, bearing up under, and he finally says, he says in verse 4, if you'll do that, if you'll let your faith produce this steadfastness and let it have its full effect, you will be perfect and complete, he says, lacking in nothing. Perfect and complete. I had to look up those words because they seem like they're just saying the same thing twice. There's a little bit of nuance to each of them. Perfect, from what I gather, the word there kind of means it has a goal in mind. Whereas the word complete means more here, right now. So perfect as in a future goal and complete as in now in the present. And I thought that was very interesting. But if we'll just let our faith produce steadfastness, we will be perfect in the future, so to speak, and complete, whole now as we're working through it, lacking nothing, of course. And then verses 5 through 8. This is kind of the next little section. If somebody will read that, verses 5 through 8.
If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind.
Super good. So you may lack wisdom in your trials. I don't know about you, but that seems like a given. I don't know. Maybe some people go through trials and they just know exactly how to handle all of it. I'm not one of those people. And so we most generally lack wisdom in how to navigate difficult circumstances. And so James says here, ask God. That's how you fix that. Ask him, and he's going to give it to you, and not just give it to you, but he's going to give it to you generously. He's going to be very generous, and he's giving of wisdom to you, and he's going to do it without reproach. The word there means to chide or to taunt. In other words, God's not going to make fun of you for asking for wisdom, is the idea, which is a great comfort, that God loves us so much that He wants to grant us wisdom, but He just wants us to ask. And He wants us to ask, of course, according to the next verse, verse 6, to ask in faith. So here's the second occurrence of that word, faith, in the letter. He wants us to ask in faith, but without doubting. Because, and here's our first word picture here. Mm-hmm. The one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that's driven and tossed by the wind, or driven and tossed by the trials. But God doesn't want you to have that kind of faith. He wants you to have a faith that's steadfast. It kind of reminds me of when Jesus was walking on the water. Or remember when the disciples were on the boat and there was a big old storm, and and it was just crazy, and they see that, and Jesus was able to still it, just like that with the word. It's kind of like that. So God doesn't want you to have a faith that's chaotic. Does that make sense? But instead a still and steadfast, firm faith. So here's our first word picture. This faith that's driven by the wind and tossed about like a wave of the sea is without direction. Verse 8 describes it as double-minded or unstable, right? So that's a very dangerous faith to have. We don't want that kind of faith. Of course, we can see how unstable is contrasted here with the steadfastness that James talks about in verse 3. All right, so there's verses 5 through 8. The next little section is
I didn't read all the way to 8, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I didn't even notice. I was looking at my notes. But anyway, that's the next section. So the next section after that is verses 9 through 11. I think it's 9 through 11. Some might include 9 through 12, but I think it's 9 through 11. And we have our second word picture here. The text just says, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. Because the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls and its beauty perishes, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits." Now, I've always thought these are like such weird verses to put right after verse 8. They didn't ever seem to flow for me very well. But as I was studying this, I could see why this isn't the only time that James will talk about the rich and the poor. He talks about them next in chapter 2. But of course, he's bringing up the point that everyone faces the same end. Wherever you are economically, socially, politically, everybody faces the same end. The text is kind of interesting though, and so I really had to break it apart for me to understand it. He says basically there's an equalizing situation that happens here. So he says here that let the lowly brother boast or take pride in his exaltation. So the lowly brother, he's contrasting with the rich. So this would be those who are, and he means the poor, those who have no means or less means. Let the poor brother take pride in his exaltation. That's not right now, but it's in the future. Because at the end, there's a crown of life that awaits, right? He mentions that later in verse 12. So the poor can boast in their future exaltation, that crown of life. And the rich can take pride in his humiliation now by this is where this becomes interesting, by practicing humility being rich. if that makes sense. So he could take pride or boast in his humiliation now by practicing humility with his riches rather than boasting, because those things are all going to pass away. Everybody is. That's what he goes on to say. Like a flower of the grass, he'll pass away. The scorch, everything's going to perish. But this is how you equalize the two categories, or I don't want to say classes, but two groups of people here. You have the poor Christians, you have the rich Christians. The rich tend to boast in their riches, but James says no, instead boast in your humiliation. Practice humility, let that be your pride, not your riches. And I've never been like a rich person, like a millionaire, but I can imagine that might be a difficult thing to do. Just because we're all rich in this country, and when you go to a third world country, that really gives you an opportunity to practice humiliation. I can see how that could be a difficult thing. It's not, you're so used to a way of life, a certain thing, like that, and then anyway, so that could be a real struggle for a rich person to practice humility in that with their means. Whereas you have the poor person who doesn't even have that temptation or that, but they can glory instead, boast, take pride in the fact that their exaltation is future. It's coming. They have a crown of life, the glory of heaven, all of those things in the future. That's the way I understand these verses, and how and why I guess James puts them in here. He's equalizing everybody, basically. Everybody's facing the same end. And he ties it up in verse 12. Blessed or happy is the man, rich or poor, right, who remains steadfast. So you see he connects that with verse 3 and the whole idea of steadfastness. Blessed is the man, rich or poor, who remains steadfast under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised future to those who love him. So there is our second word picture in these verses about the grass and the flower and it all withering and falling away. And death being the great equalizer here of whether you're rich now in this life or not. Let's see. Oh, I have a really great quote. I thought one of the commentaries I read said this: because the life of the rich is so radically different, they must exercise self-abasement. This self-denial of the rich believer is their way to participate in the total trust required by God. Does that make sense? It's their way to participate in the total trust, in practicing humility, in having an active faith, I guess. Anyway, I thought that was a good way to sum it up. Let's see. We see James, of course, James is borrowing with this word picture of the grass and the flower, the scorching heat and the sun. Y'all remember Isaiah 40, where Isaiah talks about all flesh is as grass, and the beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of God endures forever. Okay, so there's that. There's another one in Psalms, Psalm 103, that kind of says the same thing. So James is borrowing here, I think, from Old Testament texts about this idea. Verse 12, we already talked about that. So remain steadfast, whether you're rich or poor, remain steadfast under trials, and you'll be blessed, happy. It's the same word that Jesus used in Matthew 5 in the Beatitudes, where he said, blessed is the man who, blessed is the man who, blessed is, it's the same word. It means happy. This is how you're going to be happy, if you remain steadfast under trial, which sounds counterintuitive, just like joy, right? Mm-hmm. It seems counterintuitive to count it all joy when you're in the middle of a trial. Mm-hmm. It seems counterintuitive to be happy in the middle of a trial, but this is what those words mean. Because a crown of life awaits. It is I have in my notes, it's a future certainty to both the rich and the poor. Okay, so there's that section. Now the next one. This is verses 13 through 16 about temptation. So would somebody like to read that? Verses 13 through 16.
Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers.
Okay, very good. So this is where the word tempted comes in, that varies from the word trials that we've been talking about. This is an actual personal occasion to disobey God here that you face and struggle with in your life. It's not an external circumstance that's happening to you, but something that's very personal to you, and it will be different for you than for me, probably. We may face some of the same temptations to sin, but we might face different ones. You may face one that I have never faced before or don't have a problem with or a struggle with. I may have have a certain struggle with temptation that you don't even think about ever. But that's what we're dealing with here. Basically, James is just saying, don't say that it's because of God that you're being tempted, because he says God can't be tempted by evil, and therefore he won't tempt anyone with it either. He's not the source of sin. Instead, he says in verse 14, we're tempted when we are lured and enticed by our own desires. So it's our desires that are the source. Now, the devil, of course, has his place. We know that he's a roaring lion seeking somebody to devour. But here James is focusing on the believer's part. This is the focus of James here. The focus is on the believer's part in his own temptation. In other words, you and I can't play the victim card when it comes to our sin or our temptation. It's because of our own desires that we are tempted, and so we are now introduced to this third word picture. This is the word picture is that of conception, that of conception, conceiving a child, giving birth to a child growing up. That happens every day, right? And so James is using that analogy to describe this temptation scenario we all face here. When he says, verse 15, he says that when that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. When that desire has conceived with our will. So it's not wrong, it's not a sin to be tempted. You may be tempted by something, you may desire something, but that doesn't mean it's wrong or sinful for you to do that. Now, it does become sinful when you act on it, when you conceive that desire with your will, and you put them together and produce sin. So instead of a baby, you're producing sin, and then he says when that sin is fully grown, it brings forth death. That's the result. Let's see here. So he says in verse 16, he ties it up, don't be deceived about that. Don't be deceived in thinking that God is the source of the temptation. It all just stems from within each one of us. Deceived. The word there, I don't know if you remember, but if you look at verse 16, he uses the word deceived. That's our English translation, deceived. Verse 22, but be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving. There's the word again. Verse 26, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart. There it is again. They are all three of them different Greek words. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So if you're interested in knowing what each of these means, they each have a different connotation to them. The word deceived in verse 16 means to go astray, to roam, or to wander. Don't do that. He says, don't wander into thinking that God is the source of your temptation, in other words. Don't wander into that thinking. Verse 22, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. That word means to delude. It only occurs one other time in the whole New Testament, and that's in Colossians 2, verse 4. And then finally in verse 26, the word deceives there is a different Greek word that means to cheat. I thought that was very interesting because I had them all underlined or connected or something, and then I looked them all up and I was like, well, oh, wait a minute, they don't all mean the same thing. So I had to erase that. So there's deceive. Then verses 17 and 18. Here is what actually comes from God. Would somebody like to read those two verses? Verses 17 and 18.
Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So this is now the truth of the matter. What actually comes from God is every good gift and every perfect gift. That's what comes from him. He is the source of those things, not temptation. It says here it comes down from the Father of lights. I always thought that was a strange, interesting way to describe God, but I think that in James's brilliance, it makes perfect sense. Every good and perfect gift, he says, comes down from the Father of lights, the God who created all the lights and controls their changing. We know that there are heavenly bodies out there that God made when he said, let there be, right? And they all serve a purpose. They have their own orbits, etc. for the days and years and seasons. God created all of those things. The Father of lights. But with this Father, those lights may change and have variation, but God doesn't. He has no variation within himself. There is no shadow due to change. He is constant, I guess you could say. He's greater than the lights that he created, and he is unchanging. Therefore, there is no varying with him. And then in verse 18, he continues the conception, birth, baby analogy with saying, of his own will, he brought us forth. The actual, when it says he brought, in the Greek, it originally says he brought forth. So he brought forth is one word that means to breed, which is very interesting. It means to produce, to beget. So we can see how James is continuing the picture, the word picture of conception and birth and growth here. Of God's own will, he beget us or brought us forth by the word of truth. This is in contrast. This, I think, James is wanting us to bring to mind when God said, let there be in the beginning. By his word, the things were created, right? And so by his same word, the word of truth, he brought us forth. He begot us so that we could be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. The word of truth, the seed that grows into a new life, right? Luke 8:11 says that the seed is the word of God. And by that word, we have been brought forth. We have been born. We are a new creation, 2 Corinthians 5:17. Jesus said we have to be born of water and the Spirit. So there has to be a rebirth in John 1 and in John 3. So we see the beautiful picture, amazing picture that James is drawing here for us using this conception birth analogy and applying it to us. He doesn't just drop it with the whole picture of sin and how that's conceived and how it grows and produces death, but he goes, but here's what's really most important. You have been brought forth by God's word. You have been bred, generated, begetted, begot, produced, born by that same word of truth, and you are a kind of first fruits of his creatures. All right? And then verses 19 through 27. This is all, to me, another section. I have it titled in my notes as Faith Practicum, or Faith in Practice, because there's just so many bulletproof points here that you can just list them really easy. I think I have 12 of them or so. Just bullet point listed. He says here in verse 19, and we won't go through and read all of these, and this will really just kind of be the end of class, but he starts out with saying, know this, my beloved brothers, and then he lists them. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, because, etc. Right? And then he says in verse 21, put away all filthiness, put away all rampant wickedness, and instead receive with humility or meekness the implanted word. That should bring to mind immediately this conception birth analogy that James is talking about. Implanted word, which is able to save your souls. And then he says in verse 22, be a doer of that word. Don't just be a hearer, be a doer. Because if you are a hearer only and not a doer, he gives another word picture here. So this would be our fourth word picture of a man who looks into a mirror, and when he looks in there and walks away, he immediately forgets what he looked like because he's not a doer. He's only a hearer. Verse 25, but when you look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, that word persevere comes from the root of the steadfast word, so it kind of means the same thing. To abide or to stay nearby. When you persevere, you're going to be an active doer of the word, and you're going to be blessed. There's the word again for happy. It's the same word he used in verse 12. You're going to be happy when you're doing the word of God, not just hearing it. You're going to be blessed in your doing. That's really important. And then verse 26, a couple of more here. Bridle your tongue. Be sure you do that. If you don't, you're just cheating yourself. That's the word deceives there. Cheating yourself if you don't learn how to bridle your tongue. Verse 27, this is what pure and undefiled religion before God looks like. Finally, he closes it with visiting orphans and visiting widows, and then keeping yourself unstained or unspotted from the world. I want to point out two more Greek words that I think are very interesting and play into the beginning when God, the Father of lights, created all things. In verse 23, when James says, if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face. Natural in the Greek is the word Genesis, interestingly enough. And then in verse 27, when he says to keep oneself unspotted or unstained from the world, the Greek word there is cosmos. So we see a little bit, we get a little glimpse, even though we're not Greek scholars, we can see how efficiently and effectively James is using the Greek language to really bring out his points. Not only do we get it, of course, in English, and we see it by the use of all of his word pictures, but when we dig a little deeper and get into the Greek, we can see, oh, wow, when you're reading it in Greek, you can really see what he's talking about. Very interesting, because when we read the word deceived or deceiving or deceives, that we all kind of think of the same thing because we only have one English word for that.
Right.
But of course in the Greek there's 3 different ones, and they bring out 3 different connotations. Brilliance. So I'm very excited to study the rest of this letter.
James has always been something when I want to read, I kind of, look, read James. There's something about it.
Yeah.
But studying it this way makes it even better.
Brings it out, yep.
Yeah.
Very good. So now the practical part to all of this. So you could probably think of 1,000 things, 1,000 ways to make this practical for you. The first one that I thought that would be most practical for me, that I don't do very often or often enough, is visit the widows. So my homework for me this week is to visit a widow. And I would like to take somebody with me to visit a widow. So if anybody would like to go with me, either somebody in this class or somebody who's watching, because I know a lot of ladies asked for this handout and are doing it at home even though they can't come to class. So if anybody would like to go visit a widow with me this week, I would love that. I would love to have somebody go with me to do that. If you are unable or don't want to visit somebody, you could write a note to every widow. If you'll go through the directory and list every widow, you can write an encouraging note to each of those widows, even if you are a widow yourself. You know from firsthand experience what that is like. And you can share some really heartfelt, personal messages about that in a note to a fellow widow. I have listed here 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 in our congregation. Do we have any widowers? The only one I could think of is Ron Sarrett.
Mike.
Nations. Very good. I need to write him down. Mike Nations, Ron Sarrett. Now here are the women that I have listed: Peggy, Dorothy Chamberlain, Dottie, Betty Wyatt, Donna Tarrant, Barbara, Kim, and Kathy Dixon. I think I got them all. I'm not sure. You may think of somebody, and maybe I missed somebody, but I think that was it. So that's my personal homework this week. And if you want to make that your homework too, then get with me. We can go visit a widow together, or a couple of them, or however we want to do that. Or we, write notes or whatever. Okay, so that's my homework. Now here's the homework for everybody that applies across the board. Okay, so for chapter 2 next week. Now, for chapter 2, there's a couple of words that are in there, a ton, but I don't want you to do this homework just for chapter 2. I want you to read through the entire book again, this time looking for these 2 words. The first word is law. We've already seen it in chapter 1. It's in there. Law. And then the next word is works. So use now 2 different colored pencils. So you'll have one for law, where you'll color that one in a different color than your faith word, and then works, you're going to color that in a different color than the other ones. And that's the homework for chapter 2. But read through all the chapters, right? Mm-hmm. Don't just read through chapter 2.
So mark the words in the entire book or chapter 2?
The entire book,
that's
yes.
That's what I thought you said, so I wasn't sure why we were reading just chapter 2.
Yeah, no. Now next week we're just going to talk about chapter.
Okay,
yes, we're just going to highlight chapter 2, but and these words are highlighted in chapter 2.
Okay.
They're not going to be in every chapter, but I want you to read because they are outside of chapter 2 as well.
Okay.
But they are definitely in chapter 2. Your chapter 2 paper is going to be colorful. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okie doke. Yes, so the point, yes, you'll be reading at least 5 times through the book of James with our homework each week. All right, any questions? All right, well, that's all I have. Thank you, ladies. Look forward to the next one. I'm glad you're able to be here, Haley.
I don't know.
I don't know, I
Then I thought to myself, did I say anything? I don't ever know. I had meetings this morning at the school, and so
Yeah.
I gotta go back. And I haven't timed properly yet how long from school to here. Because I'm
Oh.
always coming from home to here,
Yeah.
you know, and so I'm like, can I turn this 30-minute drive into 25 minutes?
Probably.
Where's the school
I
at?
kinda did. Where is it at, in McKinney?
Yeah.
It's tucked away at Virginia and 75
Okay.
on the, now I have to know directions. That would be the
It's on the east side.
east side,
No, west side.
west side.
The other side.
The other side.
That's how
It's on the other side of the Jordan.
The other side. Yeah, on the west side.
It is tucked in there.
It's tucked,
It's
so
tucked way in there.
we are horseshoed. We own a lot of land, the school does, and I don't think people realize that because we're horseshoed around Bonnie Leak Park.
Okay. I'm still learning it.
Bonnie Leak is, does McKinney have like 2-3 parks? McKinney only has like 2 or
I don't
3.
know how many parks it has.
Bonnie Leak is horseshoed around our campus, and so it's very like wooded. So when I say we're tucked in, we really are, like we're surrounded by trees. As a matter of fact, we have a new playground because the river that runs through our land eroded. The playground's falling into the river, the river, the stream,
Oh, yeah.
and so it's a really, really pretty campus because it's just
I
kind of
bet
tucked
it
in there.
is. Yeah.
It started with it was a man's ranch, obviously, and the school started in his house, his ranch house.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the little
I didn't know
classrooms
that.
are in each different
Oh,
level.
Huh.
that's really cool. Wow.
Interesting.
Wow.
Really cool. So,
Let's close with a prayer. Would somebody like to lead that, or I can? Okay. You want to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for our opportunity again to gather together and learn more about your word. We specifically thank you for the gift of the book of James and its abundance of application that we can take and apply throughout our day, our whole life. We ask that you grant us wisdom while we're learning, the ability to take this out and spread all of the things that we're being taught in the book of James. Thank you so much for Veronica and her willingness to put forth a lesson for us and take the time to really dig in deep with us. It means so much to us. We ask that you watch us throughout this week and help guide us in all the things that we're trying to do. We thank you so much for your son. It's in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Haley. I just thought of this during the prayer, not that I wasn't listening to the prayer to pray. I don't know. I just thought of this. James, his name is a Greek. What would you say? I don't know the word. In Hebrew, it means Jacob. If you watch the video, the link to the video, okay, the people brought it out. So in Hebrew, his name would be translated Jacob, which is interesting because you remember what Jacob means in Hebrew?
I do know this because that's Seth's name, Seth Jacob. But you're asking, so I don't remember.
That's okay. It means
Like?
it means to supplant. It means to deceive. Do you remember? Because
I don't know.
Jacob and Esau, Jacob
Uh-huh.
deceived his brother. He supplanted his brother and he took away the birthright, took away the blessing. You remember all that, how that happened, right? And then he was deceived by Laban because he wanted Rachel. Was it Rachel? And then was given Leah. You remember? So he got a taste of his own medicine. So there was a whole big, surrounding his life and his name was the idea of deception. And how interesting it is in the book of James that he uses right off in the first chapter 3 words that are linked to deception, to his name, basically.
That's funny.
Anyway,
I'll
yeah.
tell y'all something funny.
Anyway, so I thought of that during your prayer.